Hello there, it's Austin. Today we're going to brew two pale ales on the iGulu, one using their pale ale kit and one using a traditional all grain method. So let's see how they compare. For this 1 gallon batch, we'll start off by collecting 2.8 gallons of reverse osmosis water. The fermentables we'll be adding in the form of unmilled grain is pale malt, Vienna malt, and crystal 2-row. This is a pretty familiar grist that I've used for pale ales in the past, and although it does contain a touch of color, it's mostly on the paler side of the pale ale spectrum. With our milled grains added to the kettle that we've preheated to 149 degrees Fahrenheit, it's time to add our water additions, since I forgot to do them earlier. This is a slightly gypsum heavy addition to help accentuate some hop flavors in our hops that we'll be adding later. With our 60-minute mash concluded, but our grains still in the kettle, we'll go ahead and start the preheating process to the 212 degree mark. I will be pulling out the grains at around 170 degrees and allowing them to drain while recirculating my wort to recapture some efficiency. Did notice some reduced efficiencies in this batch, and I imagine it's just because of the higher percentage of absorption that we're seeing in the grain due to the much lower batch size. With our wort now boiling, at the 30-minute mark, we'll add our first hop addition of Hallertau Magnum, and that'll be about 0.1 ounce. Our second almost comically small hop addition will be a 1/4 ounce of Galaxy hops at the 5-minute mark. At the conclusion of our boil step, we'll cool the wort down to a yeast pitch temperature of around 70 degrees Fahrenheit before transferring it into our iGulu Triton 1 gallon keg. Speaking of that yeast pitch, the yeast that I'll be using today is built up in a starter and was actually a repitch from a previous pale ale batch. It did start its life as a packet of Imperial Yeast A24 Dry Hop. I guess it's still kind of A24 Dry Hop, but maybe a slightly more house version at this point. With everything sanitized and sealed up, we'll drop the keg/fermenter down into the iGulu machine and connect the liquid line and the gas line. This will allow us to be ready to serve right after the conclusion of our fermentation schedule. Speaking of that schedule, I'll be using one of iGulu's preloaded ale fermentation profiles. It takes 12 days total and automatically transitions the beer from 65 Fahrenheit to 68 Fahrenheit before finally cold crashing it down at 39 degrees Fahrenheit for a few days. During the fermentation process, the screen will give you a readout of its current fermentation pressures as well as temperature and time remaining. When the countdown hits 0, the LED bar on the front of the machine will turn green, and then your American Pale Ale Brewed All Grain on the iGulu is ready to serve and enjoy. For a nice comparison, I also grabbed a bottle of the iGulu Pale Ale Extract Kit that I brewed. You can check that video out up here. I did bottle this into a purged bottle to try to avoid as much oxidation as possible, and I do think the main characteristics of the beer were preserved pretty well, or at least well enough for a side-by-side comparison of the two processes, both brewed on the iGulu. So I have enjoyed the opportunity to experiment around with this machine a little bit. As someone that already has a decent amount of brewing equipment, maybe too much brewing equipment, kit brewing at the 1 gallon scale just doesn't really appeal to me that much. But I thought it would be interesting to try a sort of comparison between two pale ales, one brewed with the kit and one brewed all grain. To be clear, the point of this experiment wasn't to try to exactly replicate the pale ale kit with the all grain version, more so kind of brew one based off the kit and brew one the way that I normally would and stretch the limits a little bit, see if the iGulu is feasible or offers anything for actually brewing all grain. And despite the pretty drastic color differences between the two beers, I think they actually taste decently the same. There's definitely more of a muted hop flavor in the kit version compared to a much more lively hop experience in the all grain batch. The kit beer does look a little bit clearer right now because it's been sitting in a bottle in the fridge for a couple weeks. Time-wise, when you're brewing 1 gallon of beer all grain, you're not saving that much time compared to brewing 2.5 or even 5 gallons. So it is a decent amount more equipment for a much lower yield of beer. But besides a bit of persistent haziness, the end result is pretty similar to an all grain batch that I'd brew and ferment normally. There's just much less of it. But a couple interesting conclusions from tasting these side by side. One, the pale ale kit is actually pretty decent. Certainly one of the better extract kit beers that I've had at least. And if I had any real critiques, it's pretty much just that it lacks a bit of creativity and soul compared to an all grain batch or a recipe that you might have designed yourself. Second is that if you have some hot side equipment like a kettle or a coil, and you don't mind spending a bit more time per finished beer, you can brew an all grain batch on the iGulu, and it's a pretty decent way to spund and temperature control your fermentation while you're doing it. Cheers!